Trump didn't make the problem, but his fix may be the opposite of what is needed. Trump may be the worst president of the USA in living memory, or longer. His ideas about tariffs may be based on crazy economics. But he is right about one thing. For decades, USA governments have ignored the fact that every year the USA spends a lot more money buying things from the rest of the world than it gets from selling to them. The last year it was positive was 1973. Forget for a minute why that happens and think about how it happens. It wouldn't work for you or me or our families. If we spent more every year than we got in from our wages, we would soon have big problems. We might be able to cover the gap for a short time by using our savings or by borrowing, but pretty quickly our savings would disappear. And no one would lend us any more money because we hadn't paid back what we borrowed before. It's the same with countries. They can't go on buying more stuff from other countries if they don't get enough money from selling other stuff to them. So, how can the USA get away with it? Basically, it's because other countries keep their savings in US dollars. So, if Thailand has savings from selling more to other countries than it buys from them, it will keep the extra in a US dollar account. Why do they do that? Firstly, they normally want to keep it in some other country's currency, not their own. Secondly, they pick a country where it will be safe and they trust the government not to mess with it. And they want somewhere stable and not likely to be invaded by another country. If those things weren't true, they might not get their money back. Thirdly, they will probably pick a currency that lots of other countries pick, because that makes it easier to move the money around if they need to. The bottom line is that most countries keep their savings in US dollars. Some keep them in other countries like Switzerland or the UK that also pass the same tests. They're not going to keep them in Russia or China because they're afraid the government will steal their money or make it hard for them to use it when they need it. So the way it works is that if China sells 20 billion of things to the USA and only buys 15 billion from them, China makes 5 billion out of that situation. But that 5 billion never leaves the USA. Maybe it's in a bank account in New York, or maybe they buy US government debt or spend it on the US stock exchange. Maybe they use it to take over a US business or build a new US factory. The most important thing is that it stays in the USA. That means the USA doesn't have to borrow the money it needs to keep buying a lot of stuff from the rest of the world, even if it doesn't have enough money to pay for it. This has been going on for a long time, more than 50 years. But in spite of it lasting all that time, it's basically an unstable situation. It can't continue like this forever. Maybe the Chinese decide they want to spend more of their savings to improve their standard of living. After all, they've got a huge amount of savings by now. Or maybe they want to build a factory or buy a company in Europe. If you've ever had savings, you know how tempting it is to start spending. But there is a problem for the countries with their savings in US dollars. The amount of investment and savings other countries, not just China, have in the USA means that if they started taking a lot of their savings out, the value of the US dollar would fall quickly. And all this savings still held in US dollars would be worth less. For example, 1 US dollar equals about 3 Kuwaiti dollars. Let's say Kuwait has 100 billion US dollars invested in the USA. It takes out 50 billion and converts it to euros. This caused the value of the US dollar to fall to 1 US dollar equals only 2 Kuwaiti dollars. The value of the US dollar 50 billion that is still in the USA will fall from 150 billion Kuwaiti dollars when the rate was 3 to 100 billion when the rate drops to 2. Okay, I've exaggerated the fall in the exchange rate, but you get the point. The value of their savings goes down, and that makes it hard for other countries to withdraw their savings, especially if something happens that makes a lot of them want to take their money out at the same time. Some countries might have a plan to slowly move their savings to another country, only at times when the US dollar is strong, so they get a lot of the other currency. Over time, that will hurt the US economy because it has to replace the money somehow. But much more serious is the situation if countries simply say, we won't keep our future savings in US dollars. That would mean the US has to find someone to give them money for the shortfall every year, just like other countries with a shortfall have to. The USA hasn't had to do that for at least the last 50 years. And just to give you an idea, the shortfall in 2022 was bigger than the total shortfall for the whole of the 1970s and 1980s. Or it was 9.5 times bigger than it was in 1990. So why does the US buy more stuff from other countries than it sells to them? There are two main reasons. The first is consumer spending. The American public buys a huge amount of stuff. If you're a business in any other countries, selling to the US is extremely good for you. There are plenty of customers, and each one spends a lot. So if you're Mercedes-Benz in Germany, or Samsung in Japan, or Shell Oil in the Netherlands, the USA is a major market for you. Without them, your business would be a lot smaller. They spend more per person than anywhere in Europe, Canada, Australia, or China. The second area where the US spends a lot is military. If you look at the wars, not in their part of the world, they have chosen to be involved in. They include Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and indirectly in Israel's wars and in the Ukraine. That doesn't come cheap. In addition, as Trump rightly says, they subsidize the defense of Europe and other countries like Taiwan and Japan. Originally, at the end of World War II, that made sense. Europe was too weak to defend itself and was under threat from the USSR. In the cases of Germany, Italy, and Japan, they certainly didn't want those countries building up their forces. But that logic has long since broken down. And apart from wars, the US military spending is huge, even in peacetime. And many major industries and businesses depend on that continuing. If the US trade shortfall has to be funded every year in the future, because other countries choose to keep their savings outside the US, consumer spending and military spending will be hurt. The businesses in other countries like Mercedes, Samsung, and Shell will also be hurt. This was going to happen sometime anyway. As I said earlier, the present situation is unstable and not sustainable. It was always going to unwind at some stage, with or without Trump. But the sensible way to do it would be to move slowly and give all the different parties a chance to adjust at a reasonable speed. What Trump is doing is trying to replace a system that took at least 50 years to create in 4 years. The unwinding will be painful whenever it happens. It will involve reducing the spending of USA consumers, which they will hate. Or it will involve a sharp reduction in US military spending, which means fighting against some very powerful vested interests in the US, both in industry and in the military. And they will fight it tooth and nail. Either way, it will hurt US industry and the industries in other countries that sell to the US. The best strategy for those businesses is to reduce their dependence on US sales by selling more to the rest of the world. That's not easy because demand in the rest of the world isn't growing very fast. Unless it's done very gradually, it has a strong chance of triggering not just a US recession, but a worldwide one. So, summary. Trump is kick-starting a process that was going to happen sometime anyway. He didn't cause the problem, but he is the one firing the starting gun at a time when many countries and most people didn't even realize there was a problem. His solution, tariffs, will probably force countries that currently sell to the US to find markets elsewhere. That will hurt them and maybe cause recessions in some countries. It may also cause those countries to work together to set up a new trading order as quickly as possible. For example, if Italy is importing US cars and Japan is exporting cars to the US, Japan may sell to Italy in the future and the US is out of the loop. That's going to hurt the US exporter, but maybe they can sell to the customers who used to buy Japanese cars. For the Japanese, relocating their factory to the US is very disruptive, and it will not help when the crunch on US consumer spending comes. The role of the US dollar as a reserve currency is starting to change. The pound has been on a long decline as a reserve currency, but it could revive. The euro is a possible candidate, and the BRICS economic alliance is heading in that direction. One of the reasons that Trump is so anti-BRICS. The US will be forced to finance its trading shortfall with the rest of the world in a more conventional way, which will keep US interest rates high. China is unlikely to allow its currency to become a reserve currency. The bottom line is that many countries are now looking at keeping their future savings outside the US, even if they leave their past savings in US dollars. Whichever currency they choose will automatically be heading towards reserve currency status. By 2030 or 2035, the pattern of world trade could look very different. The involvement of the US in the total amount of world trade will decline rapidly. Tariffs will do that every time. The peak of American power was between 1945 and 1950. At that time, they were the only country with nuclear bombs, and Europe, Russia, and China were in ruins. To have any country in any era that dominant is very unusual, and due to the unusual circumstances at that time. It was never sustainable. And as those countries recovered from World War II, it was in fact not sustained. Today's US economy is world leading in many areas. The switch from a manufacturing to a service-based economy is further down the track in America than anywhere else. Try finding a non-US based search engine. Google, Bing, etc. are all US owned. Non-US search engines do exist, but they are hard to find and not as good. But that is never going to replace manufacturing jobs lost in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. Americans as a whole don't want government involvement in business. They believe in the free working of capitalism and that business people, not governments or government workers, are the best people to make business decisions. The irony is that tariffs are, in fact, a massive government intervention in the workings of business. That might be a good place to finish, but I've got one more point that I really want to make, and it could be more important than everything I've said so far. Many elements of present global trade, like the EEC and the World Trade Organization, were set up following the end of World War II. There had been two huge wars only 20 years apart, and everyone wanted to do everything possible to make sure it didn't happen again in the 1960s. Trade was seen as a vital part of the puzzle. Countries that trade with each other are more interdependent, they know each other better, and are much less likely to go to war with each other. That was the founding philosophy of the EEC. And it has been amazingly successful. Sure, there have been wars in the 80 years since, but they have been regional and nothing like the scale of World War I and World War II. In the 80 years before the end of World War II, there were not only two world wars, but also major wars in Europe between Germany and France and Germany and Austria. The evidence is that the philosophy that trade made wars less likely was reasonably correct. Now, we are facing the possibility that the world will be divided into trading blocks that don't trade much with each other. What follows from that could be a lot worse than a worldwide recession.